There is a wonderful story about you and
Uh,
nothing about at a bar or a restaurant.
oh, okay.
About you coming to Leicester and seeing the original factory
Yep.
and just saying, kind of, I want that.
That's pretty much true.
But you subsequently built a much larger facility, and I understand from reading the local UK papers that you're about to embark on a second facility.
That's correct.
Because you actually are having increased demand, which is fascinating in an era when in the mass consumer market, unit sales are plummeting.
Well, keep in mind, we're not in the mass market. We're a small niche within a niche. We'd like to think we are somewhere at the top of that pyramid. We don't need a big piece to be happy. We have 120 people. We're looking for another 10 or 12. We mentioned the S4s, the 5Is, and the mini S4s. We are now introducing, 2 years ago, we introduced a series of anamorphic lenses, which, I have to thank digital for being such a, no offense to the people that shoot digital, but digital is a boring format.
DEMS is fighting words.
Having ultimate resolution doesn't necessarily make a picture that anybody wants to see.
Absolutely.
And if you can't hold the audience's attention, you got nothing. It doesn't matter how wonderful it is. So it has to be visually interesting.
And narratively interesting.
And if it's not, it doesn't matter that I shot with my gazillion K camera and made these pictures, but nobody enjoys watching them. One of the sort of the proof of this is the most popular professional camera today is the Arri Alexa, which is basically an HD camera on steroids.
2K, right?
It's not a 4K, it's not an 8K, it's not a gazillion K. It just is it is at the moment the right sort of combination of color imagery and their color science and resolution, and it just makes a pleasing image. As we saw these cameras get better and better, what did people want? They wanted older lenses to knock the edge off the digital look. But at the end days of film, you could have probably picked up a set of Speed Panchros, $100 a lens, or taken them out of somebody's trash barrel. Today, those lenses sell for $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a piece. And the reason is people are looking for ways to put personality and texture into what otherwise would be a pretty sterile picture. Digital is great. It's taken my market from being very, very small to being super big. And, in the old film days, I had, 200, 300, not only me, all of us, Arri, us, Ingenue, all my competitors, we shared the same 200 or 300 customers, the big rental houses around the world. That was it. And yes, there were a handful of directors of photography or assistants that owned their own gear, but probably 90% of our sales was through rental houses. Red comes out, the digital era arrives, and overnight we go from 200 or 300 customer to tens of thousands.
So really? Wow.
The owner of Red owned his own set of Cookes. He shot a lot of stuff. He shot a lot of his own stuff. He owned a lot of. He was a great guy who loved making his own films. So he owned his own set of Cookes, and so when you would call Red in the early days and you'd say, "What's the best? I want the best lenses." They would say, "Well, call Les at Cooke. He'll,
hook you up.
Are the best lenses.
He'll hook you up."
And so I'd get these calls from these obviously people that probably never heard of us, and they would say, "Oh, I'm getting my Red one on Tuesday next week," and they said, "You got the best lenses. Can you send me a whole set?" And I'd say, "Okay, well, sit down. I said, number one, we're back ordered for, can't send you a set for, 6, 8, 10, 12 months. 2, even if I could, a whole set of Cooke lenses, of which there are 18 in the set, will set you back, $400,000 or $500,000. And some of the people would just yell at me, "How dare you? My camera only costs 20 grand. How dare you?" There are alternatives that are not Cooke that make, perfectly good. Red has a couple lenses you can buy for, a lot less money, but, this is the reality. And to some people's credit, they stayed on the phone after that, and they actually did it, because what they started to realize, and what I think what Red did for us is, before Red came out, the balance of power was, oh, I shot with an Arri camera, I shot with a Panavision camera, I shot with a movie camera, and the lenses were sort of secondary. And that always confused me, because a motion picture camera really is just a dumb box. It just has to move the film and hold it steady. It has very little input into the artistic result. Yeah, you can do some things in camera. You can do ramping, but for the most part, the camera is a passive thing that just has to hold the film steady. Digital comes in, and now the camera is actually important. The laboratory is sitting on your shoulder. It's processing that image. But because the prices dropped dramatically, it becomes a commodity. And all of a sudden now, for the first time in my lens selling career, which goes back to the 70s, the lenses are what's important, which it's always been true, but we just never got the stature there. And Red did that for us. Immediately when Red came out, people start to realize it's not the camera, it's the lens. And the odd thing here is that in the digital realm, the camera really is important, much more so than in the film world. And the other thing is, everybody knows the cameras are going to change, if not every few months, almost every week sometimes. Whereas, again, my lenses that I made 75, 80 years ago are still making films today.
Well, let's go back to Anamorphic in particular, and your assertion that digital has given new life to Anamorphic.
Well, there's no doubt about it.
I'm sure that you're right, and I'm tickled actually to think about the connections. This is a three blind men and an elephant kind of thing. I touch different pieces of it, trying to understand the totality of what I'm looking at. And I'm thinking about an interview I had with the people who run Moondog Labs in Rochester, former Kodak employees who made the anamorphic lens used on an iPhone for the film Tangerine. So what's happening at the absolute mass end of the business is happening at the apex as well.
Yeah. Well, there are two. There is traditional anamorphic, and then there's Super 35 anamorphic, and there is some confusion that anything that's widescreen is anamorphic. And in fact, I was stunned when we introduced our anamorphic lenses. The first showing of them was in Paris, at a trade show in Paris a few years ago. And I was getting these strange questions. And I really couldn't put my finger, because these are film students, they should know. And I couldn't put my finger on the problem until afterwards I realized they don't really know what true anamorphic is. They just think anything that's shot in 240 is anamorphic. It's not true. Real anamorphic has to do with going back to the late 40s, early 50s. TV comes in. The theater owners panic. They are afraid that everybody, even though the screens are 7 inches and the pictures are terrible, everybody thinks they're going to stay home and watch the TV. Well, that screen isn't so bad these days, but it's a lot better screen, even though it's
Well, that I can cop to admitting. Hey, I grew up when there were 3 channels in New York, plus one on UHF and one public television.
So I go back before that. I remember, what was it? ABC used to be, I think, the gold network for NBC.
Channel 7 was ABC. NBC was 4.
But originally, no, that's true. But originally, ABC was a sub-network of NBC.
Really?
It was red and gold, and it was, anyway, be that as it may. So TV comes in. The theater owners panic, and they decide, because TV was 4:3 and movies were 4:3 aspect ratio. So the theater owners decide the best way to compete with TV is to go widescreen. How to do that? So there are a couple of ways. The best way to have done that, if you remember, 4x35, like that. The best way would to be 4 per 65, double the width of the film. The downside of that is, A, it's very expensive, and every projector and movie camera and lens in the world would get thrown out.
Ha! I know where you're going with this, and this really supports the idea that limitations inspire creativity.
The other way to do it is what we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, and that is crop the top and bottom of the 35 and make a 240 and throw away that top and bottom area. Basically make a 3 per 35. The problem with that, going back to the early 50s now, is that I didn't grow up in New York. I grew up in a small, not a rural town, but in suburban Washington in Maryland. And my local theater in my little town had a screen that was probably 70 feet, 60, 70 feet. The downtown, go downtown Washington would be like, the Leicester Square theaters where the screen is 1,000,000 feet wide. So the screens were very big. The state of negative and positive stocks back in the 40s and 50s was not as good as it is currently. So they thought that if they did but it was essentially Super 35 cropping, there wouldn't be enough information to fill a big screen with the stocks at the time. So that was thrown out. So the only other way around this was to go back to a tank sight that was invented during World War I. And Anamorphic is actually developed to give you a very wide angle of view through a tank sight. And actually I think in the 30s, there was a Frenchman who tried to make a movie using it, and it didn't go anywhere. But it was revived in the late 40s, early 50s. And basically what we do is we leave the horizontal, we leave the vertical the same, but we squeeze the horizontal. So if you have a 35 millimeter true anamorphic lens, it's a 35 millimeter vertical lens, just like you would expect, but it is actually a 17.5 millimeter horizontal lens where we take that angle of view and then we squeeze it to fit in a 4:3 frame. And then when you project it,
you have an anamorphic at the other end.
Right. So to work in anamorphic in film was actually quite expensive and cumbersome, because you would see, it would be squeezed going into the camera, and you would work with that squeezed image through editing, all this stuff, because it didn't get unsqueezed until you projected it.
That's rough.
That was rough. And and you had to modify your cameras, you had to have special lenses. It was pretty expensive and cumbersome. And it became the bastion of the $100 million movies. And that's Panavision was basically built on anamorphic.
So Lawrence of Arabia?
That was in 70 millimeter. That was actually in 70 millimeter. But a lot of the big films and the epics were all shot anamorphically. The first film being The Road with Victor Mature back in 1952, I think. Digital comes in, and then what happens over time is, because anamorphic is hard to do, because stocks and print stocks got better, we started doing the Super 35 crop and just shooting it spherically. Didn't have to change anything. You're just you're not getting as much negative information, but because stocks are better, print stocks are better, screens actually became smaller. That was okay. Digital comes in, and people are looking for ways to put personality and character into what is otherwise a pretty sterile image, or can be a sterile image. And anamorphic, old lenses took off, as I said earlier. Old lenses that were thrown away all of a sudden became worth tens of thousands of dollars. Anamorphic is a perfect way to solve this personality problem. Because when you do a real anamorphic lens, when you're squeezing and unsqueezing, it adds all kinds of artifacts.
Let's use a different word, just because I'm so intrigued by it. Because the essence of what you're saying is that a tack that was taken for competitive reasons, for cost effectiveness reasons, gets a second life because in the process of using this cost-effective means, imperfections were introduced into the imagery. So at the edge, there's a cost to squeezing at the edge, and that shows up in imperfections. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, there are all kinds of other interesting artifacts or imperfections. For instance, in a front anamorphic lens, which means that you do your squeezing in front of the iris. There are two ways to make an anamorphic lens. One is you do your squeezing in front of the iris, or you can do it behind the iris. And you do the squeezing with cylindrical elements, which are a real pain in the ass. Yeah, they're cylindrical. And they're a real pain in the ass to make and measure, and they're terrible, but that's the way we do it. The advantage of doing a rear anamorphic lens, that is doing your anamorphic squeeze behind the iris, is that the cylinders become, as that cone of light, comes down to a point, the cylinders are very small in the back. The disadvantage of doing an anamorphic lens, rear anamorphic lens, is you don't get the anamorphic character. You don't get a lot of the artifacts, because if you do it behind the iris, it's lost. The downside of doing a front anamorphic lens is the cylinders now are getting very, very big as that cone of light comes in. But you get all this wonderful anamorphic character that people are looking for. Anamorphic lenses, front anamorphic lenses, have what's called the bokeh isn't round. Bokeh is oval.
Right. I saw the examples of that on your site.
Right. And I'm not saying that people sit in the movie theater or watch it on TV and see these out of focus areas go oval and think, oh, yeah, that's an anamorphic lens. I mean, most people other than a professional isn't going to know. But somewhere back in their mind, they're thinking, that's different, kind of interesting.
This is so interesting because right as we speak, two things are happening. One, still in beta, is Apple with the iPhone doing computationally based bokeh, only for still lenses at this point. And Sony just announced a lens, it's a completely different part of the market, using something called STF technology, which creates even more, in theory, perfect cylinder, perfectly round bokeh. And your experience and the feedback that you've gotten from the top of the food chain is, that's not necessarily what you want.
Right.
How interesting.
As I said, people don't sit in the theater saying, oh, look at that. But somewhere in the back of their mind, they're saying, oh, different. And usually it's a good difference.
That's not the only imperfection that anamorphics introduce.
No, there are lots of imperfections. There's the field curvature is usually much more extreme in a front anamorphic lens. If you think about it, one of the things that makes anamorphic interesting is that we use the term kludge again, but that's literally what we've done. We've taken a 35 millimeter vertical lens and kludged it with a half of that focal length wide lens. So now, if you think about this, we have two depths of field in that lens. You have a horizontal depth of field and you have a vertical depth of field. That's all part of the flavor and how things move, how you move through focus. It makes them extremely visually interesting. And digital makes it easy because, as they said in the film, they work with it compressed until you projected it. In digital, you probably never even see it compressed. It's compressed on the chip, and you flip a switch, and you're in the viewfinder, it's uncompressed. And everything in post is uncompressed. So your work, so it's just much easier in digital.
Although you can make the argument, can't you, Les, that this would be a reason to go to higher resolution just so that you can get more image information at the edges.
I had an interesting discussion with a post-tech guy, not an artist, and he was telling me, it's such a waste to use these older lenses or anamorphic lenses on these high-resolution cameras because the lenses can't resolve. His thesis was the lenses can't resolve that much information. I'm not so sure that's true. People have been shooting on my old lenses. I mean, people rate negative film, modern negative, at somewhere between 6 and 8K. Nobody's complaining I think this whole resolution battle is a red herring, frankly. Nobody complains that, oh, gee, they used that old speed Panchro on that 8K negative, and oh, I can, it looks terrible. I recently took one of our anamorphic lenses and put it on the red helium. They're 8K.
That's the 8K.
Super 35 camera. And I have to say, there's something to what your argument that you've just put out, because I have to say it looked remarkably good. Even if I can't, even if I cannot resolve besides the 8K, just having that additional information, even if it's soft, fuzzy stuff, did add something to the image. I have to say, it looked remarkably good on the helium.
So do you have a new line of anamorphic lenses?
We have so many new lines, I can't keep up with it. That's why we're building a new factory. So we have the regular anamorphics that we introduced about 2 years ago. And then we are just introducing what we call the SF set, which is SF stands for special flare.
Is this the uncoated front lens element?
It's not really uncoated. They're coated differently. If you go to a lot of anamorphic movies, they have those horizontal streaks going across. And while our regular set of anamorphics can do that, we sort of design them so they don't do that. You got to really work at it to get that horizontal streak. And then if you're J.J. Abrams, you want that horizontal streak everywhere. So we did the special flare set. And it's not that they're uncoated, they're just coated differently. And it makes it very easy to get that horizontal flare. We then went back to and then we're also doing front anamorphic zooms to complement the prime lenses.
Wow, that sounds complex.
35 to 140 that we've been delivering, and then this year we'll start delivering the 45 to 405.
45 to 405?
They're big studio lenses. They're not handhold. They're not made for hand holding. We're also introducing this year what we call the Panchro Classics. The speed Panchros, as I said, have become wildly popular because they do add, a degree of vintage and texture, vintage look with texture and personality to these digital images. So we went back and we dug out the old designs and we're remaking them. So we're going to have a set of Panchro Classics that we'll be showing at NAB. If the pre-orders maintain, they're going to be wildly successful. And, again, we're just trying to give cinematographers as many tools as we can so they can get the images they want. In the film world, there were a dozen film stocks, and there were all kinds of, every lab had different processing tricks. So the cinematographer could get whatever kind of feel and look he wanted. And that all got wiped out with digital, The digital now, you've got a Sony chip, an Arri chip, a Canon chip, a Red chip, and it's handled very differently. So that's why people are looking to the lensing to get the image they want, because they don't have as many tricks as they used to have. And the other thing is that we work differently today. In the old days, again, going back to film, which was only a few years ago.
Hey, I recently rewatched the 1996 film, The Rock. Not everybody is into that kind of film, but I loved it. Sean Connery's probably last and best gasp at a James Bond-esque figure. And I read that they used 3 different film emulsions, none of which was rated above ISO 500.
Right, and that was just, to get the kind of look in the various scenes that they wanted.
You've got these different coatings, these different anamorphics. You're really responding.
We're trying to give creative tools to the cinematographers to tell their stories. And hopefully, my thinking is if the day we start resting on our laurels and think that we've arrived is the day I should sell the company and get out. Because we always have to keep moving forward and giving people new tools to do their job. So, we went from having barely a company with, we started with the S4 lines with making 4 lenses, just 4. That has expanded over the years because of demand from our customers to 18 lenses. Then we introduced the 5i series, the Mini S4 series. Mini S4 series was really introduced along with digital to give people, at a lower price point, the ability to use Cooke glass.
Well, let's just talk about that specifically for a minute. What do the Mini S4s cost, and what T-stop are we talking about?
They're T28, and they look indistinguishable from the S4s and the 5Is. In fact, the film Hugo was shot on a Lexus, but it was shot in 3D, so it was shot with two sets of fives in an over-under 3D box. And when they realized, because this was one of the very first films Alexa did, they realized how fast the camera was. They then added two sets of fours and two sets of minis. So all that Steadicam work, some of which is quite remarkable in Hugo, was done with Mini S4s. And I defy anybody to say, "Oh, well, that was a Mini S4 shot. That's a 5i shot. That's that's an S4 shot." They all have the Cooke look, and if 2.8 or slower, they should all look roughly the same. So the minis were introduced actually, to give the up and coming digital guys the taste, if they wanted to switch to Cooke, a way to get there. One of the things we did on the minis is we also made them available. In addition to the regular front and rear elements, you can also change those to uncoated front and rear elements to add more aberrations, more flares, more personality. And then recently, mainly because of demand, we started doing the same thing, offering uncoated front elements for the S4 series, which is something I've resisted doing for a long time, because uncoated glass is subject to atmospheric stains. And so whenever we sell the uncoated glass, we warn the users that certain glasses are more sensitive than others, but over time, this glass may discolor, may get what's called stain on it. It's just part of a natural process, and I can't control that unless I coat it. So if you want uncoated glass, the risk is over time, it will discolor. The reality is much of that makes absolutely zero difference, except when somebody's looking at it and says, "Oh, look, there's a mark here. It's slightly discolored over there." Most of that, I took a mini lens once, and I did a presentation at the ASC, the American Society of Cinematographers. And of late, what's become the bane of every lens manufacturer's existence are these LED flashlights, which are like shining 1,000,000 watts of light through a piece of glass. If you shine enough light through anything, you're going to find a piece of dust, a small defect. And so I took a lens of mine, and I took a screwdriver. I didn't do it. I had something I couldn't do it. But we took a big gouge and we put it in the front element. So nothing. If you were an assistant that had both eyes working, you would look at this and say, "I can't accept this lens that has a big gouge in the front element." We put it on a camera and shot with it, and you couldn't tell. So a lot of what people look when they're looking at lenses, they're looking for the raw. They're looking. Certainly, you're spending a lot of money for a lens. You don't want it to be. I wouldn't buy a lens with a big scratch in it either. But my point to these guys is, almost none of this stuff has an effect on the image.
I love this story, and I'm also looking at the time. We've gone way over the time that you've allocated, so I really appreciate that.
You did want to come back to the arc light. You said to remind you about the arc light.
All right, let's cover that right now. Because the fascinating thing to me, again, this notion of truly understanding what it is I like fast glass. And I like fast glass for a couple of reasons. I really do use depth of field as one tool among several for isolating what I think is most important.
It's exactly what it's for.
Of course, what we talk about less is the framing. Joel Meyerowitz, the photographer, not the only one, but famously said, photography, and by extension cinematography, is framing. It's what you choose not to put in the frame. So that is another way of isolating. And then, of course, once you leave the image Sound can be used to isolate. Dialogue can be used to isolate. But I like fast lenses for that reason. I also like fast glass because in the budget range that I operate on, which is literally a small fraction of what we're talking about here, and you get down to micro four thirds, you want to send as much light to that sensor as possible, just like you did in the old days. And in fact, before the arc lights, and you would know this because of your company's history, the first studios were built outdoors, and then that moved to like glass houses, greenhouses.
You know, I lived not far from West Orange, New Jersey.
And exactly, Black Maria.
Well, I don't know how they made movies in there. That box was hot.
Yes. Yes. So this is really fascinating because it comes around full circle decades later that you want fast glass again, because it's not the issue of arc lights, it's the issue of getting rid of artificial lighting and having glass fast enough and sensors sensitive enough to get at it.
I would question a little bit of that. Certainly selective focus is what makes 35 work over the old video 2/3 inch format. Whenever, for years in the 2/3 inch world, they were saying, we want to get it to look cinematic. And usually what they mean by that was get selective focus, which is really just a function of how big the sensor is.
And then that's when they had the spinning glass adapters.
Yes, yeah, I used to sell those too. the Pro 35 and the Mini 35. Yeah. But everything has a price, and in physics it's unforgiving. So at T1.4, very fast lens, the depth of field at some focuses is plus or minus a millimeter.
Yeah.
So I don't care how good you can focus or your focus puller is, it is not possible to hold focus on a living, breathing thing at T1.4. Just isn't. So, I work with a lot of clients. Now the TV is getting into large format cameras. And so I work with this one network that uses a one-man crew, just like they used to do in video.
Yeah.
Well, they're now using, large format cameras, and they want to shoot at 1.4. And they ask me, what do you think our stuff looks like? And I say, it looks like shit. There's no way that even with a focus puller, you could hold focus at 1.4, much less a cameraman that's trying to do it, frame and do everything. I said, if I were you, I would lock every lens off at a minimum of T2. At least then you have a chance. So I think you have to be careful about this. And also, I'm a firm believer in lighting.
I made the point too extreme. I agree with you 100%.
I do believe if you know how to light, you can shoot in any format without a problem. And if you don't know how to light, it doesn't matter what the format may save you occasionally, but for the most part, if you don't know how to light, you can't shoot.
Hey, look, right now, let's say I would say it's about 3 feet away from me. I'm shooting with a 3-foot circular diffuser on top of a single point light source. But I get you. This is, by the way, what I normally shoot against. That's my editing suite in the background. And I like blurring out the background. But at 1.4, which I was shooting with yesterday, I can't stay in focus.
Right, you can't. It's not possible.
So really great points. Well, anyway, so we got to the arc light. Thank you.
My pleasure.
What an education. I did want to just come back to the point that we got away from a little bit. The mini S4s were designed to make Cooke more accessible to the new digital filmmaker. So let's talk about pricing for a minute. So one way is to buy it, another way is to rent it. So what do those numbers look like?
Well, the rental, we only sell, so you'd have to check your local rental company. And most of the bigger rental companies have minis. They sell for about $7,600 a lens, so they're still not inexpensive. Also, though, we've now introduced Won't help you if you're shooting Canon, but we now have a Sony E mount and a Micro Four Thirds mount.
You are kidding.
That will go on the Mini S4s.
We're going to have to talk about it after this is over.
Okay.
Well, is there anything else that we missed, Les? Because I just think this was a lovely romp through history.
We've been talking now for, an hour and a half, so we missed quite a bit. We could probably keep this up till the day is over. But
Two old guys talking stuff.
I think we've covered a good survey of Cooke, and I would encourage people to go to our website up there. If they want more history, there's a whole history section on the website, just tracing our lineage all the way back to the beginning, and of course all our products and information up there as well.
Along with something called Cooke TV, right?
That was the one more thing. Thank you for bringing it up. We recently, about a year ago, introduced CookeOptics.tv. It is not a sales pitch for Cooke. It is really sort of a labor of love and education. We talk to DPs, directors, all kinds of people in the industry, and get them to talk about interesting things, how they interact with directors, how they interact with actors, how they framed a particular shot. A lot of them don't use Cooke, much to my horror, but we really interview people that are interesting. And so I would encourage you and your viewers to take a look, because they can learn a lot about a lot of different topics. We've got quite a bit of content up there, and we're adding more almost weekly now, where we've talked, as I said, to some of the top people in the industry, and they're just imparting their knowledge.
CookeOptics.tv. I'm sorry, I was about to sign off again, but Micro Four Thirds and Sony E mount. Tell me a little bit more about this, because your lenses have traditionally been PL mount.
We've always been, always. We've been PL since PL came out. But obviously, because of people like yourselves and all these new cameras, we know a lot of people are using adapters to put our lenses on these other cameras. And so we simply, we wanted to do Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Four Thirds. In theory, Canon is possible, but because they put their little electronic strip inside the mount, it causes a conflict. But with Sony E and Micro Four Thirds, they're deep enough that we have, it's deep enough that there is no conflict. So we have hard mounts. You can take off the PL and you can put on the Sony or the Four Thirds mount.
When you put on the Sony or Micro Four Thirds mount, are these still eye lenses?
No, at the moment, although we are talking, we have a really good relationship with Sony, and we are talking to them and seeing if we can come up with some way to bring that through. But at the moment, no.
Well, that is just fascinating. It gets back to your point about not resting on your laurels. Well, wow. What a thoroughly enjoyable conversation. Thanks for taking your time, Les. For Three Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. If you liked it, thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation, because the quality of the conversations we're getting these days at Three Blind Men and an Elephant is truly lovely. I learned so much, not just from guys like Les, but from you.